What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Niners News here on 49ers Hive. My name is Zach Hernandez. I'm joined by my friends Matt Llewellyn and Scott Gewen. Matt, how you doing?
I'm tickled, Zach. How are you?
Doing good. Scott, how you doing?
Having a lot of fun.
All right. Glad to hear it. Today, guys, we're going to be talking about the 49ers 2020 season and whether or not it's a make it or break it year. Matt, looking back on previous teams that have gone to the Super Bowl and lost it, and then the year after that, what indicators are there to kind of feel what is in store for the 49ers this season?
Well, you see that the well-run organizations typically tend to hover around playoff contentions and get back to where they are. Think of the Patriots, think of some other teams that have lost Super Bowls and come back the very next year. And you see the bad teams like the Los Angeles Rams who put their entire cap into three players who don't even make the playoffs. For the 49ers, a make it or break it, I don't know exactly what that means. Are we talking about winning the Super Bowl? We're talking about making it back to the playoffs. I think making it back to the playoffs should be an acceptable outcome for this next season. You want to make sure that they don't have this severe drop off and, that they can be competitive because let's face it, it's hard to get to the Super Bowl. Even if you win it, it's hard to get back. Tom Brady and Bill Belichick notwithstanding, it's not normal for teams to always be in the Super Bowl hunt. It's just not. You think about the Kansas City Chiefs. They hadn't made the Super Bowl since Super Bowl V before this. So even a well-run organization like the Chiefs is going to struggle to get back there. We just need to make sure that the 49ers are still in contention, and I think that John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have them in a really good position cap-wise with the way they've kind of layered their players between veterans and young guys that they can keep the competitive window open for a while.
Interesting. I like how you broke that down, based on teams like the Rams or teams like the Patriots. It's kind of, everyone kind of views it as success, I guess, differently. Scott, how would you view it as a break it season? How do you define that?
As far as definitions, I think, again, it is, getting into playoff contention. I do wonder, obviously, everyone ultimately wants to win the Super Bowl. And I do wonder whether we'll get a better chance. Obviously, it's hard to predict looking forward, but when you look at the way the roster is constructed right now, whether this is basically the best chance they're going to get for another couple of years after this. Traditionally, kind of when you look at the stats of teams returning to the Super Bowl, most teams drop out of the playoffs 2 years after a Super Bowl loss. A number will maybe drop out for a year and then get back, but others might have 2 years of playoff success and then drop out. So it tends to be kind of a 2 or 3 year window in which teams can kind of make the playoffs consistently and then try and get into the Super Bowl. Because it's obviously a very different ball game once you get to that point. But I think for the 49ers, when you look at how they've constructed the roster, the way that John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have basically prioritized defense because they trust that Kyle Shanahan is some kind of offensive whiz. He's a genius. He can create offense with not necessarily the highest caliber of player, whereas they've tried to sort of stack the defense with talent. One of the most important parts of the defense is the secondary, and that's an area that we may be about to see a substantial amount of turnover on after the season. So Richard Sherman is he's not getting any younger. He's coming to the end of his contract. Is he going to want a last big payday? Is he going to be worth that amount of money to the 49ers by the end of the season? Who knows? Jaquiski Tartt is another one. Will he come back, or has them paying Jimmy Ward kind of put pay to their ability to pay another safety? Will they have to replace him with Harris or Moore or another player? I think even K'Wan Williams, his contract might be expiring as well. We still don't really know who Emmanuel Mosley is. We've got Ahkello Witherspoon, whose contract is expiring. There's a lot of question marks in the secondary, and you do wonder, well, I know they've been prioritizing pass rush, and they did very well to replace Button with Kinlaw. That was a great kind of window opening move, I think. But I do think that on the back end, at least, the 49ers have got questions that will mean that for them this year could be a make it or break it year as far as getting back and being in genuine Super Bowl contention.
I think the thing that stuck out to me from your answer the most is within 2 years, teams are kind of out of the playoff hunt. And for me, I think that's how I would define this is if they do not make it and or win the Super Bowl this year, is this their last chance for another couple of years before you get into that next cycle of, rebuilding and getting, closer each year? Because we've all agreed they were a year early last season. But what does that mean in terms of their trajectory and in terms of their lifetime length span, so to speak, Because is that mean that it's shortened now by a year because they were a year early? So it's tough for me because the way I think about it is you both agreed the main goal should be to get to the playoffs. What if they lose in the wild card round? Is that still a successful year for you guys? Matt, you can go first.
Overall, I would say that probably would be. And just to add on to what Scott was saying about the defense coming up, with word coming out that from George Kittle's agent that he wants wide receiver money, this could be the last year of George Kittle too. I mean, to be honest, I don't know that the 49ers have 15 to 17 million to toss into a tight end, which is unfortunate because of how important he is. But if you view this regime running this team like the Patriots are run, where you cycle talent in and you maybe get rid of a guy a year too early than a year too late, maybe they can keep the window of contention open. And there have been times where Tom Brady may have lost in the divisional round, where he didn't get to the Super Bowl. But the thing that you want to have is sustained excellence. So you might not necessarily win or get to the Super Bowl every year, but if you're always floating around that 10, 11, 12 wins, you're going to get there eventually just by the law of averages. Really, you want to build a strong foundation and then accessorize as needed, given your cap situation, given the players available, given your draft positioning and the assets that you have there. And what your goal is to maintain a viable franchise long term. And, it's easy to put, like the Rams did, go all in for a Super Bowl in 1 year, but that's really short-sighted because it leaves you short. So if the 49ers got to the playoffs and eventually bowed out in the wild card round, it would be disappointing just because we know how talented this team is. But if you trust in this regime to build the team the right way, there's no reason why they can't cycle some players out, get some new ones in. And as long as the scheme and the strategy for team building is sound between Lynch and Shanahan, there's no reason why they shouldn't be a perennial playoff contender every year.
I'm so glad you touched on George Kittle because that's a huge aspect. This team, we saw how they performed without George Kittle for a few games last year, and I don't know how they'd look without him permanently. It would be a huge loss for not only the offense but for the whole team. Scott, let me ask you the same question I just asked Matt. If they made it to the playoffs, to a wild card round and lost, is that still a successful year in your view?
No, I think it probably would be, as Matt said. I think it would be a disappointment because we know how talented they are. We know that this was a team, as Matt said in a previous show, that was blowing teams out, was averaging a substantial size of victory over their opponents. And for that team to sort of basically lose Buckner, one player, and then potentially reinforce the offense and potentially have better health on the offensive side of the ball, not lose an offensive tackle, not lose Kittle, not lose Juice, for that team to only get to the wildcard round, I think would be a letdown. I also just wanted to touch on a little bit on what you said earlier about arriving a year too early. I actually think when you look at the way the roster was constructed, they arrived right on schedule. Kind of, we knew going into last season that Jimmy Garoppolo being injured was creating kind of a real artificial floor and an artificial ceiling on what this offense could be. And then obviously when we knew that the defense, when they added Nick Bosa, we already felt, I think a lot of people felt that the defense was talented enough to have been making a better push than it was. And that by adding kind of one is essentially one of the best defensive ends in the NFL, by adding that took the defense to a whole new level. So I don't actually know whether they arrived a year too early. And that is my main concern, is that, to Matt's point about kind of viability, this year's draft was made more difficult by the Emmanuel Sanders trade. By losing those mid-round picks, by knowing you needed to replace Sherman, probably you potentially need to replace Tarr, and then obviously this Kittle situation, your ability to add sort of high-end potential replacement talent in this year's draft was significantly lessened by that trade, losing those mid-round picks. Obviously, then they did the Buckner trade. They traded for Kinlaw. That then enabled them to add a high-end talent for cheap, potentially get left more money, allowed them to re-sign Armstead and Ward. So they've done things to move around. But I still think that there's a question mark over kind of, if they don't do well this year, how quickly can they get that new talent in and recycle in, and how quickly will that new talent be ready to start be performing on the level that we've seen from the guys who we're potentially expecting to depart? And that's the big question for me. Perhaps this does mean that if we don't do it this year, they'll have a year out of the playoffs, but then it's going to be, contingent on Lynch. I think Matt's right to say that we need to trust them to essentially cycle through talent and be able to identify replacement level players who can perform ahead of or perform in place of the guys that were expected to depart. And that's their job. And I don't think we have any reason to doubt that based on how well they've recruited so far.
Okay, Matt, let me ask you this. In terms of make it or break it, we're talking about the team success from a kind of like a player standpoint. What about from a team building and a coaching standpoint? Are questions going to be raised about Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch if the 49ers take a step back this season?
It's hard to say that about Lynch because you look at what he's done to get talents around. Now, whether that's Adam Peters or whether that's John Lynch himself or whether that's Kyle Shanahan kind of interjecting and telling him exactly what he wants, because we know that Kyle will flex his voice when he feels he needs to, that remains to be seen. But for Kyle Shanahan, I would say that some of the coaching gaffes that he has made, where he tends to outthink himself in late game situations. You know, sometimes he gets a little too cute. Sometimes he gets a little too basic. He goes away from what's working. Those are the things that you kind of want to see him clean up on. Don't believe he has a very good record in challenges. Maybe he needs to take a look at that, maybe get a little bit better at that. Obviously, everybody can improve. And I think that that is something that needs to happen for this team to, you know, kind of continue forward. Ultimately, the players execute what the coach puts out there. And if the execution isn't good, well, then the execution's not good. And so there's a limit on how much you can put on Shanahan and Lynch. Ultimately, the players have to play. You hope that the injury bug kind of swings back in their direction. I think the law of averages, they're kind of due for a healthy season, which would be huge for them. They've been one of the hardest hit teams in the NFL over the last couple of years. The one I can think of off the top of my head. The other one would be the Chargers, who have just been decimated by injuries year after year. So you'd like to see some healthy players out there, so that way you're not cycling through 5 offensive linemen in the middle of the season. You know, you don't lose Weston Richburg again late in the season. So the coaching, it's important, but temper your expectations on how much that truly affects the game beyond play calling.
Okay. Well, guys, that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Niners News here on 49ers Hive. Make sure you follow us all on Twitter. Our handles will be below on the screen. Make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.
Click that bell for all your notifications. We're bringing you 49ers news every day of the week.
Thanks, guys.